So thank you all for coming, and we'll take some questions.
Governor, every year in your executive budget, you have a page in the front that acknowledges that state spending is about $21 billion. Then 95% of the rest of your executive budget deals with the general fund. If these issues are so important, why didn't you deal with them in the executive budget?
Because that's not orange, unless you change apples to oranges and oranges to apples. That's what gets debated every single year in the General Assembly. As you know, before this administration came in, never before had executive branch actually produced an operational executive branch budget. As you know, the budget hearings that we held were all about trying to build moral authority to pulling up a chair at the budget table, because historically governors had never been involved in the budget setting process at all in South Carolina. And so I think that what you want to do is always put the cart before the horse. And the first step when you're trying to pull up a chair to the table that governors have never really been involved in is to begin where things are. And where things have always been has been the General Assembly coming in, deciding on the $7 billion back and forth, or $67 billion back and forth. And that is the place you start. What we also did, though, is you correctly point out, say, let's look at the whole. You know, this is the whole. This is what we got to debate, but this is the whole. So I think we're doing the most that we could do, given the setting that we were stepping into. And you can look at a lot of provisos we actually proposed. They dealt with money outside of the appropriate $6 or $7 billion. So not only have we talked about it, we've in fact in many cases tried to do something about it. But in case you missed the vetoes, there are clear limits as to how much executive branch can do on that front.
Well, and also, I think you raise
I
just think you raises a good point that I want to draw on. We don't really know how much of the fee and fine money can be controlled. A lot of that stuff is automatically triggered by old statutes that are on the books already, and it is not clear whether in an individual appropriations year those dollars can even be controlled by one state budget. I'm not sure that they can, and that's the large part of the problem.
John, I can amplify the governor's response because I did end up being chief of staff, but prior to that I was legislative liaison for the governor, in charge of interaction with both the House and the Senate. And I can't tell you how many times I went to members of Ways and Means and went to members of Finance and said, I'm not a budget expert, but I realize that we're spending a lot more in this state than the $6 or $7 billion you're debating. Where is this debate taking place in regard to the other funds, which I'm told is $7 billion? The answer to me was, that's taken care of automatically because we have statutes in place which dictate where the money go. We have regulations in place that provide the agencies with the authority on how to raise those fees, and that if you want to know more about that, go to those agencies. Well, as a practical matter, I don't have time to go to the 80 or 90 state agencies and to wade my way through that process. So to suggest that this is something that is brand new or something that the governor is shining the light on for the first time is not the case. The reason we're here today, and the reason that I worked with Ashley Landess starting about a year ago toward preparing this report, was to raise the level of consciousness in regard to the money that is spent effectively offline, so that we could create the kind of political pressure in the General Assembly to change the process. Right now, the executive budget deals with the Appropriations Act because that's the only game in town you can participate in. What we're trying to do is change that paradigm. So this is not something new, but this is something that's actually being raised to a higher level of consciousness.
And that's clearly what we set out to do in analyzing the budget, was to see how these dollars are spent and what the different triggering mechanisms were. And what I will tell you is, you really cannot discern that from a look at the appropriations bill. And that's one of the biggest problems we have in state government. It's not even clear how much control these guys have across the street right now. Anybody else? Questions?
Thank you all.
Yeah, one quick question. What is, besides the moratorium, what is the next step that you want to happen?
Besides the moratorium, the next step would be what I call a 72-hour bill, which would require the Senate Finance, when it passes a bill out of Finance Committee, to have that placed online in an easily accessible way to the public, and that any formal deliberation on that budget be deferred until the following week. I mean, right now the House has such a due diligence or a cooling off period in place. The Senate does not. So if I were to talk about the two substantive policy proposals that would come out of this, from my standpoint, and again, I'm one senator. I can't act without getting with my colleagues, but I can tell you my sentiments. The first would be to put a moratorium on fees so they can come before Senator Thomas's committee and justify what they're charging. And the second would be to go ahead and have this 72-hour waiting period coupled with an access to that budget that's readily available to the public. And I think those would be the two things right now that I think would start down the road to more transparency and to more public involvement.
Tom, how is the budget not accessible now?
Well, I don't think the budget is very accessible in terms of an unsophisticated layperson. My citizens back in Hilton Head or back in Beaufort, I honestly don't think that by going to the South Carolina Legislative website and going to the appropriations bill and looking at those lines, that it really is an efficient way for them to understand what's going on. We live in the information age, and citizens are becoming more and more used to being able to go to their computer and to get information, and not only get information, but get it in a way that's meaningful to them and in a way that they're able to understand and then to act on. And I don't think you discharge your obligation as a legislator simply by slapping something up on the legislative website that isn't in a format or in a way that involves the citizenry. And that's my opinion, and based on the feedback that I've gotten from citizens who say, we'd like to participate, but we really can't effectively. And that's in regard to the $6 or $7 billion in the appropriations. There's absolutely no way for them to understand anything in regard to the $7 billion in fees and licenses and sales of publications. I mean, quite frankly, if you talk to senators, most senators will tell you they have no idea where those fees are going. So if the legislators who are up here actually passing laws that allow that money to be expended, if they don't know, how are people out in South Carolina going to know?
I mean, how should the budget be presented then?
I mean, I am not a graphic consultant, but I can tell you one way it should be presented. I think it should be presented in sections. I think there should be summary sections at the end of each section which describes what your budgetary priorities are, which should increase, which should stipulate the increases that you made, which would explain why you didn't fund certain things. I mean, in short, all the rationale that goes into developing the budget ought to be presented in some sort of a narrative form so that people at the local level can go ahead and understand why their legislators made the decisions they made. And quite frankly, putting up a very complex and impenetrable set of numbers isn't discharging that function. We live in the 21st century where information now is more readily accessible than ever, and yet we have a system where the public becomes advised as if we were in the 1960s.
I mean, say something similar to what the governor does with the executive budget.
Exactly.
I think what's interesting about that too is the mandatory 72 hours. It's up online for 72 hours before any action is taken, guaranteeing that people can jump on and take a look at it before it's debated on the floor, and have that time to have some input, and let rank and file legislators do the same.
And that's exactly right. It's not just educating the citizenry, it's educating the legislators. Because quite frankly, based on my experience in the executive branch, there are about 4 or 5 people in the General Assembly who understand what's in that budget. Okay, that doesn't do anybody good when the rest of the 170 don't. Okay, and their votes count just as much. So it not only provides an education function for the people, it'll provide an education function for the rest of the legislators so they can make an informed vote.
So ultimately, will fees and fines be debated every year along with the rest of the state budget, or since they're regulated now with these regulations and rules that are at each state agency, would that have to be debated every year, or how would that work?
I think a better way would be to go back and let's look at the statutes, let's look at the regulations that go ahead and provide these automatic triggering mechanisms for those fees. And at a bare minimum, let's go back and look at some of these outdated statutes and outdated regulations. I mean, so you've got to have some delegation of fee-making authority to agencies. I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is that right now, legislators, because of the statutes on the book and the regulations on the book, the number and how old they are, they don't know what they are. So I would suggest a thorough and exhaustive review of those authorizing statutes and those authorizing regulations, and then a policy determination be made by the General Assembly as to whether or not those mechanisms are actually generating dollars that are going to worthwhile programs. And I think that's long overdue. And quite frankly, let me say this. This is something that Senator David Thomas has shown leadership on. This is something that Senator Thomas has recognized as a problem. What I'm talking about today is trying to engage in a dialogue that helps him accomplish that which he has already recognized is a problem, and that which this Policy Council report documents is truly a problem.
Can I interrupt? In other words, I unfortunately have to go, but the thing that Tom is getting at is more timely now than at any point in a very long time. This idea of a sunset commission has been talked about in terms of outdated laws. What he's really talking about is a sunsetting to fees that may have long outlived their usefulness. And in the kind of budget year that we're in, if there is ever a time to be doing that, I think this would be the year. So again, applaud what y'all are doing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thanks
Governor.
you all.